Hi, everyone. My name is Sanders Kleinfeld, and I'm excited to welcome Emily Levesque to Talks at Google today. Emily is an astronomy professor at the University of Washington, where her research focuses on understanding how the most massive stars in the universe evolve and die. For her work, she has received the 2014 Annie Jump Cannon Award, a 2017 Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, a 2019 Cottrell Scholar Award, and the 2020 Newton Lacey Pierce Prize. She holds a bachelor's degree in physics from MIT and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Hawaii. She's here today to discuss her new book, The Last Stargazers, which chronicles the daily adventures of astronomers across the globe as they travel to observatories in some of the most remote locations on Earth, harnessing the world's most powerful telescopes to uncover the mysteries of the universe. Thanks so much for joining us, Emily.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to talk to you about your book. So for this book, you interviewed over 100 astronomers about their day-to-day experiences in the field. And there was one quote that really stuck out for me. Astronomer Mike Brown said that it was the most exciting, boring job in the world, which you said was wonderfully accurate. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what a typical day in the life of an astronomer looks like for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mike Brown's description was really dead on in that it can be a very complex job that when everything is going smoothly, it can be a bit of a surprise, but also, wonderfully reassuring. The only problem is that I think everything going smoothly doesn't happen that often. One of the most common misconceptions that people have about astronomers, and it's something that a lot of my colleagues mentioned when I interviewed them, is that we spend all our time at telescopes, that we're sort of these nocturnal geeks that spend all our time in a basement somewhere or hiding in a dome and then occasionally emerge to kind of see what daylight is like. And in reality, we spend most of our time at our laptops working with data that we've gathered on only a handful of nights at telescopes. Getting telescope time is really competitive. You apply for it like you apply for grant funding or other resources. And when you're allotted a night, that's your night. People will typically build a telescope schedule and say, all right, you have Wednesday. And if it's cloudy or if the telescope breaks or if anything goes wrong, that's it. Somebody else is coming on Thursday with another telescope program and another science goal, so you're just out of luck. So it makes the actual nights at the telescope a little tense. There's this sort of sheen over all of it of, oh God, I have to make the most of every second that I have available. So you show up with a plan, you hope the weather's cooperating, you hope nothing's broken, you frantically get the telescope ready, you point to the star or galaxy that you want to observe, you click go, just open a camera and start an exposure, and then you're just kind of there and you're waiting until the exposure finishes. You're hoping everything's working, and it can turn into this very sort of low-key pattern, assuming everything's going well. Now, the second something goes wrong, the second there is a cloud blocking your view or something malfunctioning on the telescope or a change in your plan, you immediately jump into this panic. So I think the most exciting, boring job in the world kind of spans if everything's going well, you can relax, but things don't often go perfectly well every night.
Yeah, I totally felt that as reading the book. And related to that, I was thinking about how in popular culture, astronomy tends to be depicted as incredibly glamorous. We see all these pictures of brilliant scientists just peering into a telescope, like you were saying, and seeing these pristine, dazzling images of the night sky. But there were so many descriptions in your book about how historically the actual act of observing has been so unglamorous. My favorite quote was you were saying the observers would then disperse to their respective telescopes for another evening of scrambling into cages, slicing their hands on glass plates, and shivering for hours on end in old flight suits while peeing into thermoses. So
yes,
that's about the most unglamorous thing I can think of. And I'm just curious, were you surprised when you jumped into the field that it would be like this, sort of almost like a bait and switch, like you're expecting one thing and getting another?
a little bit. And it was actually something that I had in mind when I was writing The Last Stargazers, because people love the gorgeous photos that we get of space. You see Hubble photos on the cover on the front page of the New York Times or the cover of magazines, and we like to ooh and ah over how pretty they are, but we don't know the story of how those photos were gotten and what scientists' jobs are actually like. I totally didn't know growing up. I learned what scientists did from watching movies like, Twister or Contact or Jurassic Park. It seemed like scientists mostly spent time getting chased by their science. And when I actually got to college and started doing this, it was interesting to start getting windows into what a night is like. And the stories that my colleagues told me about occasionally when things went right at a telescope, but let's be honest, the stories are usually better when things go wrong. The tales of, oh, did you hear about that guy who was in a telescope when it got struck by lightning, or the person who had a raccoon climb into their lap while they were observing? And the stories were entertaining, but they were also this first peek into, okay, that's the background. That's the behind the scenes look at how scientists work and the weird, wacky adventures in the middle of nowhere on these mountains with raccoons that we wind up going through to end up with the pretty telescope photos that everybody knows.
Yeah, yeah. As I was reading it, just so many stories of bizarre occupational hazards that I would have never thought of, when just thinking about what an astronomer does on a day-to-day basis. There were so many great stories in the book. I was wondering if you had one particular story that really stuck out with you, or was a real favorite of yours.
It's funny because it's always hard to pick a favorite thinking about the massive variety of stories that my colleagues told me and just the things that I've gotten to experience on my own. One of the sort of wilder stories for sure is the story that I heard from a colleague who was here at the University of Washington, and he happened to be alone on the summit of a small observatory here in Washington when Mount St. Helens erupted. He was safe, but the eruption wound up completely throwing his entire day, off kilter because he was asleep when the volcano erupted. He woke up, opened the door to step outside, and he was just met with this cloud of black smoke. Like it smelled like brimstone in the air. He's trying to he grabs a flashlight beam and points it outside, and the flashlight beam is swallowed up after 10 feet. He thought he was in the middle of the end of the world because he's in the middle of nowhere alone. It's before you can, check your phone for a notification of like what happened. So he was running inside and, fiddling with the radio, trying to figure out what had happened. And I don't think when thinking about being a professional astronomer, it would have occurred to me that you would be riding out natural disasters or riding out, having a bear wander into the observatory, which is another story that I got told. And then on the flip side, people have some just exquisitely beautiful experiences being in these places. I remember seeing the Southern Lights. It was the first time I'd ever seen the aurora from the cockpit of an airborne observatory. So a telescope that's mounted in the back of an airplane. And that was so unbelievably memorable. It was just heart-stopping to see that while ostensibly doing research and thinking, okay, I'm in an experimental aircraft flying through the Southern Hemisphere, seeing the Southern Lights. I did not think this would be a part of my job. And so many people had similar stories like that, where you really do just get caught up in the beauty of it, even as you're there to do the nuts and bolts of the science.
Yeah, so those stories, especially the ones with things like the bear and the volcano, really hit home for me, something that I hadn't really thought of before, which was just how unforgiving and subject to the whims of nature and society it is to be an astronomer. So there's often, like you were mentioning, this incredibly small window of time to do an observation, to capture data that's critical to your research. And even one little thing goes wrong, you could lose that opportunity. So I know you've told some stories about that from the book. I'm just wondering how astronomers cope with that. That seems really like psychologically stressful.
It is. It's an interesting stressor of the job. And I've known people who have put life plans on hold for a year because they had one night at a telescope and something went wrong and they didn't get data that was crucial for something like a PhD thesis. Mm-hmm. And they would typically have to wait an entire other year until it got scheduled again. So sometimes people will take the approach of having several irons in the fire and having several projects that they can work on. Sometimes I think you just literally yell at a cloud and sort of vent your frustration. But it adds an interesting emotional tenor to everything that we do. And the work is all being done with this funny combination of some of the most gorgeous technology on the planet. Some of our modern observatories are just astonishing feats of engineering, but we've also stuck them out in the middle of nowhere. One of my colleagues described it as we take these beautifully engineered things and then we just torture them because you're tossing them on a remote mountain that goes through blizzards or will get swarmed by ladybugs or will, have all sorts of other tech problems. And it's a funny balancing act between the incredible engineering, the, whims of nature and of our own planet, and then the wildly far-reaching questions we're trying to answer. Because you're doing this work to answer questions like, where did the universe come from? How did we get here? Are we alone? And they sound like wildly lofty cerebral questions. And then you're usually in there going, oh, there's a ladybug in my instrument. And it's a fun contrast to get to live through.
Yeah, it's kind of really wacky to think about it, that you're like you plan for a year to do this, you got your telescope day all set up and everything, and I think you told one story in the book where were all prepared and then it was a little too windy, and it's just sort of like, oh, game over, that day's gone, and you're have to wait for whenever your next scheduled opportunity is. So
Yep.
that's rough. Wow.
There's I know that there's people who will joke about there being a sort of karmic balance of like, oh, well, if you got completely lost due to wind on one night, and I've flown to Chile and sat inside a telescope that never opened for 2 nights because it was too windy to ever open, and you hope, well, I'll try again and maybe then I'll have an exquisite pristine night. There's also jokes about people that kind of carry an observing curse with them. They'll see someone coming up the mountain and they're like, oh no, Tim is here. Tim always brings bad weather. This is going to go terribly. But in the end, it tends to work out. We have just as many wonderful nights as we do difficult nights. And we try to build telescopes in places that will cooperate for the most part.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about telescope technology, because I think a lot of people have a very monolithic perception of what a telescope is based on what they've seen in TV or movies or the mass market versions that are available for hobbyists to purchase, where you've got this long tube and you're pointing it at the sky and looking through a lens. But in reality, it really struck me from reading the book, astronomers are using a really diverse set of observation tools. And throughout the different chapters of the book, you give a tour of some of those tools. So in particular, you talk a lot about optical telescopes versus radio telescopes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the differences between the two types, and when you're using one and when you're using another.
Yeah. So the first thing that tends to surprise people when we talk about professional telescopes is just the scale. We also actually have a picture of one of these. If we can pull up slide number 5, you can see a picture of me standing underneath the 8.1 meter diameter mirror of a telescope in Chile. And that's what we call the primary mirror. It's the mirror that's pointed straight up at the sky, that's just collecting the light that rains down on it. And you can just see the sheer size that we're dealing with there. So it's much different than the little backyard telescopes that we're all used to looking through. And then if we can pull up slide number 2, you can see a sense of how these telescopes are built. So that's the Palomar 200-inch telescope in California. And the big primary mirror that we just saw in the last picture is near the bottom of the screen. And then high above that mirror, we'll have something suspended. So that something could be a camera. Back in the day, that camera was accompanied by a person who would be huddled up there working with the telescope. Or it could be another mirror that bounces the light off to a camera or a detector that's kept elsewhere. But we're really dealing with building-sized creations that are collecting light in these curved primary mirrors and then focusing it to somewhere. So radio telescopes actually very much work the same way, but they're just operating at very different wavelengths, because the radio light has a much longer wavelength than the light that we can see with our eyes. So the scale that we can build them on and the precision that's needed is very different. So if we pull up slide 6, you can see a pretty famous example of what radio telescopes look like. So this is the Very Large Array in New Mexico. Anybody that's seen Contact may recognize these. It's a very cool and very photogenic observatory. I actually got to work here for a summer. And each of those antennae that you see is a single radio telescope. So the basic design is kind of similar to what I just described. You have the big curved dish that's collecting light. It's just collecting radio light. So it looks like sort of flat metal to our eyes, but it would look shiny if we could see radio wavelengths. And it bounces that light up to the little receivers that you can see poking out of the dishes. And the physics of the whole thing is the same. We can just build them way bigger. There's a rule in astronomy that dictates how precise and perfect your reflecting surface has to be as a function of the wavelength that you're looking at. And for something like the light we see with our eyes, these mirrors have to be ridiculously perfect. If people remember the whole debacle of Hubble getting launched out of focus, that tracked back to Hubble's mirror being a little too flat by a size that corresponds to less than the width of a human hair. It was a teeny tiny error, and they thought it was potentially catastrophic when Hubble launched. And for comparison, if we pull up slide number 7, we can actually climb on and walk on the dishes of the Very Large Array. This is me sitting on the edge of one of those antennae, because since we're working at longer wavelengths, the dishes don't have to be quite as precise. They still need to be pretty great, but it's a little more forgiving. So as you move to different wavelengths, you just start dealing with different quirks of physics and different kind of potential issues or potential engineering details that you'd have to deal with as you build and work with the telescopes.
Very cool. So when you're doing observations, do you typically use both optical and radio for the same stars or locations that you're looking at, or are some locations better suited to radio versus optical observation?
Oh, it's a good question. Sometimes people will specialize in a particular wavelength. So there's people who are dedicated radio astronomers, and they're experts in all the individual quirks of radio telescopes. Some people are dedicated optical astronomers or X-ray. We really cover the whole electromagnetic spectrum. We tend to build radio and optical telescopes in similar places because we want them to be very far away from civilization. In the case of an optical telescope, you can think of something like light pollution from a city. With radio telescopes, we are also talking about light pollution, but the light might be emission from a microwave or a Wi-Fi network. If you pull up slide number 8, this is the old Green Bank 300-foot telescope in West Virginia, and this telescope was built in something called the National Radio Quiet Zone, where there's a little 20-mile area around the observatory where people can't have microwave ovens, they can't have Wi-Fi, they even drive diesel vehicles because the sparks in gas from spark plugs in a gas-powered engine emit radio. So we have to keep the light pollution very low for radio telescopes. It just means something different because the tech that produces radio interference is different than what we'd see for optical interference.
Wow, very, very cool, but also it's just interesting to think about how, susceptible they are to just our everyday lives and why they need to be so remote, because just a small cell phone signal could possibly make things go awry or something like that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So before reading your book, I always thought about astronomical observations happening in one of two venues: on the ground, like in the observatories you've shown, or in space via the Hubble, like things like the Hubble telescope, like you were just talking about. But I learned from reading The Last Stargazers, there's actually a third venue, which you were alluding to earlier, on an airplane. So you did some research aboard SOFIA, the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. And I was curious if you could talk a bit more about what that experience was like.
Yes. So this is something that honestly even surprises astronomers, because we are so used to thinking of, you're either on Earth or in space. And the whole reason that we take telescopes to space is to get clear of the problems caused by our atmosphere. And these can be just really basic things like, the atmosphere is a little turbulent and it makes stars twinkle. So to get really nice, sharp pictures, it's best to just get clear of the atmosphere entirely. But you also run into problems like, the water vapor in our atmosphere can absorb infrared light. So there's specific wavelengths that are really hard to get from the ground, but you don't necessarily have to go all the way to launching a space mission to get clear of the water vapor. So if we pull up slide number 10, you can do something like this. So this is the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy, SOFIA. And it's a infrared telescope built in the back of a modified Boeing 747. And it's designed to fly up at altitude at about 43,000 feet with the door open. And the telescope is in its own little sealed off chamber. The plane will take off on a given night and fly a very specific flight pattern so that it can sort of turn around and point at specific targets that it's trying to observe. But it's this kind of fun solve of getting above water vapor without actually having to launch to space. I also interviewed colleagues that do things like balloon astronomy, where you'll send detectors aloft on giant research balloons, or even suborbital rocket astronomy, where you launch a little like parabolic rocket and the rocket's in space for like 5 minutes, but it'll be all they need. And this whole field of airborne astronomy is just sort of wacky. I remember hearing about it from one of my professors at MIT, and he was telling us about, there's a telescope in the back of a plane and we pointed at things. And I had barely flown on a plane at that point in time. And my main experience with telescopes was in the backyard. So I had this mental image of like a scene out of Air Force One or something, with these astronomers like holding on to something and like dangling out the back of a plane with the telescope, just like, yeah. And I was a little disappointed to learn that that wasn't the case, but I did get to fly on SOFIA. The slide number 11 actually shows what the inside of the plane looks like. And you have the sealed off chamber sort of on the left side of the slide 11 photo. I think once we pull it up, And you can see sort of control room banks of computers that control the telescope, that control the camera on it, that keep track of the plane. There's a crew of about 20 people that fly whenever Sophia observes, including pilots that have to fly a flight plan that stays precise almost to the second. And I mean, the whole telescope is mounted on this giant ball bearing to keep it from being too susceptible to turbulence. So it was an really unusual observing experience, and that there were so many more moving parts. It was also really fun to get on the plane and be there when they pointed this telescope at the star that I was trying to observe, and to see how normal it looked. Now you're looking at data coming in going, oh yeah, this is astronomy. This is what we do. We're just in the air while we're doing it.
Yeah, it's so cool. And I remember from reading the book that you also were susceptible to some of the vagaries that exist on the ground of weather conditions, because you had initially planned to go on one specific night and things just didn't work out weather-wise, and you had to wait, I think, another 6 months or so before you went again.
Yeah, no, all the same issues that can sort of befall a normal observing run just get worse when you're also trying to do it on a plane. There were things like, oh, we can't, I think the weather had gotten very cold and ice was forming on the wings, and you can't de-ice Sophia the way that you de-ice a normal plane, because once a de-iced plane is in flight, anybody that's been on one has seen this, you get that like orangey stuff like kind of flying past the window. The de-icing fluid would go falling into the telescope chamber and get on the telescope mirror, and that mirror is so precious and delicate that that's a non-starter. So once there's ice on the wings, they're just like, nope, we're done. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was reading and I was like, oh, thank goodness you got to go in the end. So that was great. It was such a great story. And another great story that you talked about in the book later on was about one of the most exciting astronomical discoveries in the past decade, discovering evidence that proved the existence of gravitational waves. So as part of your research, you took a tour of Washington State's Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, where you said there was a gravitational wave first detected in 2015. So for those of us lay people, can you tell us a bit more about this discovery and its significance?
Yes, so it's helpful to start by talking about what gravitational waves are. So these are ripples in the fabric of space-time, which sounds like science fiction, but is real. It's a consequence of Einstein's theory of general relativity, and kind of grows naturally out of how we imagine the way that space and time and gravity all work together. And you can picture them if you imagine kind of holding a slinky in your hands. And there's two ways you could make a wave with the slinky. You could kind of pick up one hand and watch the wave do this, or you could take your hands and push them closer together and watch a little density wave move back and forth. And that density wave is what a gravitational wave is. So it will pass through space-time, and it will pass through everything sitting in space-time like Earth, and it'll kind of squeeze and stretch the Earth a little bit as it passes through. And the catch is that these effects are tiny. So the first gravitational wave that we detected was from the collision of two enormous black holes. These are black holes with masses that are 20, 30, 40 times the mass of our sun. And the gravitational waves sort of rippling out from this epic collision are about 1,000th the size of a proton when it comes to how much they squeeze or stretch space-time. So to detect these, we build observatories like the one that you can see if we pull up slide number 12. So this is one of the two LIGO facilities built out in Eastern Washington. And these are two long arms set at perfect right angles to one another that are mathematically exactly straight. They're actually taking the curvature of the Earth into account. Each arm is 4 kilometers long in total. And what they'll do is they'll shoot lasers down the arms, bounce them off mirrors at the end, and then shoot the lasers back. And if everything's working perfectly, the lasers arrive back at that central building at exactly the same time. If a gravitational wave has gone by, it's squished one arm and stretched the other. So you don't quite get the lasers arriving back at the same time. You get a little interference signal that we see as a sort of blip or chirp, signaling that a gravitational wave has happened. So they built these facilities. These were decades of work by a 1,000+ person team. And the challenge wasn't so much detecting gravitational waves, it was not detecting everything else. Because anything that moved those arms or anything that moved the mirrors that the lasers bounced off of would show up as noise or show up as an excess signal. So they were dealing with things like people's footsteps in that building, or trucks driving by on the highway, or waves hitting the shore on the Washington coast 200 miles away. Earthquakes happening on the other side of the world would just ring the planet like a bell and would shake the detector. So the engineering that went into making a detector that was so perfectly sensitive that it could filter that, but catch a tiny ripple in space-time is just astonishing. I think it's some of the most beautiful engineering that humans have ever done.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I think you mentioned how mundane the building looked from the outside, but it's just this incredible feat of technology to be able to do that at that level of sensitivity is incredible.
It reminded me a lot of the sort of optical observatories that I visited, because you are completely in the middle of nowhere and you're driving through a desert in this sort of out of the way road, and you see just a building. Or like this little concrete barrier protecting those arms. And you kind of have to stop and realize, you would not give that a second glance if you were driving by the side of the road. And then you turn into the parking lot and think about it. And you're thinking, I'm at one of the best physics facilities on the planet. I'm at a place where such shocking research is being done, but it's so utilitarian and it's so just focused on the nuts and bolts of how to do the science.
Yeah, I guess when you think about it, you're like, oh, there should be like a neon sign or something, but the world doesn't work that way. So
right.
It's like amazing discoveries happening here.
When you see labs like that in movies, there's usually, like there's a helicopter flying over for some reason, and there's a big giant sign going, like amazing research facility, and there's blue LED lights for some reason, and there's so little pizzazz relative to the shock of the science that they're doing. It's just a funny contrast.
Yeah, it almost makes it even more impressive that it's just so understated and there's no fanfare.
Yeah.
So in one chapter of the book, you talk a bit about the challenges that women and also people of color have faced in pursuing a career in astronomy, which has traditionally been a very male-dominated field. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, and as well as share some of your own personal experiences.
Yeah, this was a piece of astronomy that I thought it was really important to talk about, because The Last Stargazers really looks at the human experience of doing our research. And that experience has been really different for my colleagues of different genders, and especially people that were in the field several decades ago. It's an interesting point to make that I get asked very often, what's it like to be in such a male-dominated field? And astronomy is kind of interesting. In 2017, women earned 40% of astronomy PhDs awarded in the US. So the representation of women in astronomy relative to a field like physics is actually pretty high, but the representation is just one small piece of the puzzle. There's a lot more to be said about how women move through the field. The representation of Hispanic women or African-American women is very different and very low. And it's a reality that the field is very much grappling with, because we want to make studying the universe available to everybody, but we also have to make the field a welcoming place. And back in the first half of the 20th century, women were, for example, not allowed to be primary observers at major telescopes. There were two big observatories in California that had dormitories, and the dormitories were nicknamed the monasteries because only men stayed at them. Women were strictly forbidden from staying there. Supposedly it was set up because they didn't want astronomers' wives following them to work. But it then became a real problem when women were saying, we want to use these telescopes, we want to do research. And there were brilliant women doing just groundbreaking early work. Women like Margaret Burbage, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, but she made the discovery that everybody's heard of when we say a phrase like, we are all star stuff, or we are stardust. She was the researcher that discovered this, that stars make most of the elements that we see in the universe. And when she tried to observe, she was forbidden from being the primary observer. Her husband, who was a theoretical astronomer and didn't use telescopes at the time, was the observer, and she was his assistant. And they couldn't stay in the dormitory. They had to stay in this miserable little unheated cottage elsewhere on the mountain. So it reflected something I've seen over and over in a field like astronomy, that you have brilliant, passionate women who really want to do this research, and these barriers thrown up in their way. It didn't stop them. It just made life that much harder, and it gave them extra hurdles that they had to deal with in an already challenging field. So I get to talk to a lot of these women about how that evolved and changed and about their experiences. And it's been really interesting to watch that change and to be a woman in the field and to hopefully see the progress that we're going to keep making.
Yeah, yeah, it was wonderful to see, you talk about some of that progress in the book. I think you mentioned one particular anecdote that the Hubble Telescope committee changed their process for reviewing proposals to make it a dual anonymous process.
Yes, we used to have people's names on observing proposals. Astronomy is also a very small field. There's about 50,000 professional astronomers on the planet. And we very oftentimes wind up knowing each other in huge swaths. So you'd read a telescope proposal, and even if you didn't maybe know somebody personally, you'd go, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. And they were worried that assumptions were being made about somebody's seniority in the field or somebody's gender, or that people were even subconsciously implying things about whether they thought the person writing the proposal was really capable of doing the work. And when they pulled names off of the proposals, the results really changed. And there was a much higher fraction of women awarded Hubble telescope time once it was no longer obvious who the women and who the men were writing the proposals.
Yeah, it's a little dispiriting to hear that, but it's also incredibly positive to see that making change is just about like being able to give people an equal shot. So that's really great.
It's often a dispiriting fact for people to tackle, and I know that it's something that anybody in a science and tech field can run up against, because you kind of want to think that scientists are going to be above this somehow, that we're, these pure beings of logic and reason, and we would never be brought down by something as mundane as bias. And nothing could be further from the truth. And it's one of the points that I try to make in The Last Stargazers, that science is done by people, and people with our like the quirks of human life that we're tackling on a day-to-day basis, the problems that we have to overcome with things like this. So it's important to kind of point out the human quirks that can help science in some cases, like the curiosity that people bring to their research, but also hurt when you run into problems like this.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people to keep in mind, that you can never fully divorce from that human component. We are humans and we carry ourselves with us throughout our work. So relatedly, I'm curious, what's up next for you in terms of your research and your work? You mentioned, I think, that you were researching red supergiants. Are you still continuing to do that?
I am. So red supergiants are, I think, completely fascinating stars. They're much more massive than our sun. So they're 10, 20 times the mass of our sun. And they're near the ends of their lives. So these are stars that are getting ready to die as a supernova and leave behind something like maybe a black hole. Everybody's probably familiar with the most famous red supergiant, which is Betelgeuse in the constellation Orion. Betelgeuse is one of Orion's shoulders. So I'm really interested in the physics of kind of how these stars die and what happens if these stars have a binary companion that they swallow, or that they're just orbiting with and exchanging mass with, or if these stars are spinning very quickly, or if they have some other quirk of their chemistry that can affect what happens to them. So I have a wonderful research group here at the University of Washington who's doing work on things like red supergiants with those binary star companions, or red supergiants in other galaxies. An amazing capability of modern telescopes is that we can pick out individual stars in galaxies well beyond the Milky Way. And that effectively gives us stars in a totally different laboratory with different chemistry and a different history that we can test theories on. So we're really trying to disentangle the physics behind why these stars die the way they do and what happens to them.
That's super exciting. It sounds like hopefully there'll be another book in your future on that topic, hopefully.
Maybe. I'm a big fan of very weird stars, and I've thought a lot about writing about just sort of the weirdest stars in the universe, the stars that are ridiculously enormous or that are behaving in ways we just cannot explain, that are really stymieing what we know about physics, because by poking at sort of the weird corners of astronomy, we usually wind up learning really surprising new things about astronomy as a whole and about some of the rules that we have to impose to explain how the universe works.
Yeah, sounds so cool. So we have some audience questions that I want to pull up and give folks a chance to ask questions in the Q&A. Can we pull up a question? This is a question from Justin. Justin is asking, as an aerospace engineer and former SpaceXer, I love space and wonder what's out there. Where in the universe would you like to go? Or is your favorite or where is your most favorite or most curious about?
I love this question. Somebody actually asked me this not too long ago on a podcast, and it led to this amazing thought experiment of what would astronomers' jobs be like if we invented faster than light travel and we could go to the things that we study. Because astronomy as a science is really odd in that we can't, for the most part, we don't get to take our data into a lab. Light is all we have to study, and the occasional gravitational wave. So I always imagined what it would be like to get into a spacecraft and go to Betelgeuse and actually look at a red supergiant up close and get a good detailed look at what it's like. Or to go to, it would be so fascinating to do things like operate a telescope from Mars or operate a telescope from the surface of the moon, which we have actually done. Apollo 16 brought a little telescope to the surface of the moon and observed ultraviolet light from there. So there's the idea of just going to another planet and doing the same astronomy that we do, but I would want to jet off to a dying star or a black hole or another galaxy and almost sightsee, but just try to drink in as much as I can if we could actually go to what we're studying.
Awesome. Do you have another question? Chicken and egg question. Do astronomers direct their research based on what's possible with today's telescope technology, or does astronomy research also push development of new technology?
This is a fantastic question. And the answer is absolutely both. And it a bit depends on individual researchers or research groups and what their focus is. So we have people who are actively building and designing the next generation of telescopes. And a crucial field in astronomy is people who design the cameras and the instruments and the telescopes that we use. And that's driven in part by the big science questions that we want to answer. I think a lot of people have probably heard of the James Webb Space Telescope, which is Hubble's successor. And James Webb was designed to observe primarily infrared light because the people designing it knew that the infrared regime was going to hold the answers to a lot of questions we have about things like planets around other stars, or studying galaxies at the very edge of the visible universe that we can see. So the design of Webb was completely driven by scientific questions. And now on the flip side, as we're getting ready to launch Webb, a lot of us are sitting there thinking, we're about to have this amazing infrared tool at our disposal. What questions could we maybe not answer before that people haven't realized we can answer now? Or what kind of research can I do to take advantage of the resources that we have? In astronomy, kind of as a whole, there's sometimes this wonder of, well, can we just build one Uber telescope and have that telescope do all of our work for us? Or if we build Webb, do we need Hubble? Do we need giant telescopes on the ground? And the analogy one of the people that I interviewed for the last Stargazers gave me was that it's like having a suite of kitchen tools. You can have a really awesome chef's knife, but you can't cook an entire meal with just a knife. So we need Webb, we need ground-based telescopes, we need space-based telescopes, and our research is usually driven by some combination of what resources do we have available and what questions can we answer. But I think the feedback loop of it is great because observatories take a long time to build and we have to think decades into the future. So I have colleagues now thinking about the successor to Webb because it will take so long to build it. And that's based a lot on, what big questions might we have to answer and what would we need to get there. So I like that it goes both ways and that it is a bit of a chicken and egg issue.
Excellent. Another question. Thanks a lot for joining, Emily. I just bought your book and I absolutely love it. Wondering, where in the world did you see your most beautiful dark sky?
So first of all, thank you so much for buying the book. And where I've seen my most beautiful dark sky has to be in Chile at one of my favorite observatories, which is Las Campanas Observatory in northern Chile in the Andean foothills. And the trick always is to get far away from light pollution. If anybody wants to see a really gorgeous dark sky, you want to try getting as far away from lights as possible. The southern hemisphere is also just exquisite because of a quirk of how the Earth is oriented. So Earth's southern hemisphere is tipped so that people in the southern hemisphere are actually looking toward the center of our Milky Way. So from the northern hemisphere, we can see the Milky Way in the night sky as just sort of that diffuse glowing strip of stars, but we're looking out at one of the Milky Way's arms. And in the southern hemisphere, you're actually looking toward the center of the galaxy. So it's very, very bright. There's these dust lanes in the galaxy blocking some of the light, and it gives you this brilliant strip of galaxy through the center of the sky. And then around it, you're seeing just this wealth of stars. And when it's really dark, you can see the colors of the different stars. You can see the stars that you almost can't see. Like it is captivating. And I don't think I talked to a single astronomer interviewing people for this book that were bored of that. Everybody had a moment where they just described how stunning it was to get to see a sky when it was that dark. And if you ever have the chance to get to somewhere that dark and that remote and see a sky like that, I can recommend it because it takes your breath away.
It sounds incredible.
Yeah.
Question from Bridget. Do you primarily look or also listen? Have you heard any interesting sounds in your explorations?
I love this question for two reasons. First is that it gets at a really interesting quirk of radio astronomy, that people imagine radio astronomy as data that we listen to. And I blame the movie Contact in part because there's this famous picture of Jodie Foster like sitting with headphones on, listening to the data from the telescopes. You can convert the data into sound, but radio is a wavelength of light. So we can capture it as an image just like we capture the light that we see with our eyes. And most observational data we wind up catching as images. We do occasionally convert data into sound. You might have seen gravitational waves described as sound because they are literal waves that you can sonify. You can kind of describe the frequency of the gravitational waves as a little tune. So if you look back at like press releases of when we detected the first gravitational waves from colliding black holes, you might have seen it described as a chirp. So it's this little boop sound, which is great because you wind up with, Nobel Prize winners and physicists all over news programs sitting there very seriously and trying to mimic boop as they're trying to describe the physics of what's happening. But even that will typically process as an image. The reason this is a little extra cool and why I'm a little extra excited about it is one of the projects my research group is doing is actually on converting astronomical data into sound. Because astronomy is very visual, it's also a field that really benefits from citizen science. And there's going to be heaps of data coming in from new telescopes that involve things like stars that get brighter and dimmer as a function of time. And you can draw that as just a line saying, well, now it's bright, now it's dim, now it's bright, now it's dim. You could also convert that to pitches and listen to the pitch representing the brightness of a star getting higher and lower and higher and lower. And my research group is doing this specifically so that you could take data like that and make it a citizen science project for people who are visually impaired and people that can listen to data to try and pick out some quirk of how a star is varying or how a star works. There's actually things that we are better perceptually at hearing than at seeing. So I'm hoping that there is going to be a kind of wave of listening to data or sonifying data as an alternate way of analyzing it and as a more accessible way of analyzing it.
Another question. Are you seeing negative effects of Starlink and other low Earth orbit satellites on your observation? And what's your feeling about the growing number of artificial satellites?
So yes, unfortunately, my colleagues and I really are seeing the negative effects of things like Starlink. So Starlink is probably the most famous one from SpaceX, but there's others. And they're proposing these constellations of, I think, what are ultimately meant to be, in the end, tens of thousands of little satellites that are meant to serve as a constellation that can eventually give the whole planet satellite-based internet. And the difficulty is that these satellites, when they were first built, were very reflective. So they would launch and then you'd see these streaks passing through astronomical images of these satellites. So you'd have a nice picture of a galaxy and then just this mess of data from satellites passing by. A common question is whether we can computationally delete those. And unfortunately, we can't, because if a satellite passes right in front of, say, a background star or galaxy, when you delete the satellite, you've deleted everything in the background too. We're very interested these days in how the sky changes with time. So even the brief glimpse that we lose by a satellite interfering with our data can really take out important observations for the science that we're trying to do. So I think there's a lot of concern in the astronomy community right now about how to handle constellations like this. They reflect light. They also emit radio emission. So radio astronomers have a terrible time dealing with them. I know that SpaceX has tried things like painting one of the satellites with non-reflective paint, or I think they put a sort of little sunshade or like baseball cap on one of them to try and minimize the light that they would get, but it hasn't been a good fix, and it still doesn't fix the radio problem. So I think what we're all hoping for is some kind of mitigation strategy and some communication with the industry, because these are all industry missions and things that are regulated right now by the FCC. And I think a lot of astronomers are saying, we need some voice in the process, and we need to figure something out that hopefully allows the benefits that are being hoped for with constellations like this without really starting to wreak havoc on the night sky, which they are truly starting to do. I mean, if we had the full number of satellites that are planned right now, it would be very, very bad for astronomical observations. And ongoing conversation and a way to make the interference better and a way to give researchers and just the people who enjoy the night sky a voice in the conversation rather than making it be solely about FCC approval and launching them as fast as possible is a really key part of the process.
Mm-hmm. So I had one last question, because I think we're done with audience questions. I was just curious what advice you would give somebody who's interested in pursuing a career in astronomy? It was just about to start out.
No, this is a great question. People have asked me how I got interested in astronomy and then how I sort of prepared my way into the career. And I got interested as a really little kid. If we actually bring up slide number 1, I have photo evidence to back this up. So this is me at age 6, getting ready to observe with Hubble. The face is saying, "What do you mean 6-year-olds can't use the Hubble Space Telescope?" It had just been launched, and I was very proud of my t-shirt. But when I was just a little bit older than that, I met the only professional astronomer I'd ever met as a kid. Nobody in my family was a professional scientist. Nobody in my town was a scientist. But I met a guy at a little observing night, and I told him I intended to be an astronomer. And he looked at me and he said, "Okay, take all the math you can." And apparently I looked back at him and said, "Okay," and then went off and took as much math as I possibly could. So I think the corollary to that today is that math is so fundamentally the language of science and the language of the analysis and the work that we do and the language that you need to do physics, that I would similarly encourage somebody to start with that kind of background. More and more so today, computer science and programming is also such a key part of it, because so much of how we work with our data is computational. As we get bigger and bigger volumes of data, the computational challenge has really become immense. So having that as sort of a tool in your toolkit to do the research is a huge sort of basic training tool available if you want to start getting into the field. One of the telescopes I talk about at the end of the book is the Vera Rubin Observatory in Chile. So this is an observatory that's under construction. It's going to come online in the next 2 years, and it has this very simple and elegant, but very kind of amazing mission. It's going to survey a huge swath of the southern sky over and over again, taking pictures of the sky for a decade. And it will wind up giving us a decade-long movie of the night sky. And the scientific power of that is incredible, because it means we'll see any star that gets brighter or dimmer, or a supernova that appears, or a star that winks out because it's died as a black hole, or a little asteroid scooting through the sky and moving in an unusual direction that tells us it's an asteroid rather than just a background object. But doing this requires a huge volume of data. The Rubin Observatory is going to generate, I think it's something like a petabyte of data every month. And I visited this site while it was under construction, and the computational challenges of storing that data on site, of transferring that data from a mountaintop in the middle of nowhere in the foothills of the Andes to servers that astronomers can actually use, is a whole challenge on its own. And then once the data arrives, our job as scientists is to sift through it and find the one weird star that exploded, or the weird star that's burying that we might want to explain, or the asteroid that we want to study in more detail. And that's a very statistical and very computational problem. So those tools are going to be crucial when astronomy is sort of in the post-Rubin Observatory era, when that telescope is online and just generating heaps of data for us to study.
Yeah, it's exciting what's to come in the era of big data astronomy in the future.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
thank you again so much, Emily, for joining us today to talk about your new book, The Last Stargazers, which is available now, and you can buy it in ebook form or print book form in your favorite retailer. So thank you again, Emily.
Thank you so much.